Temporary building materials. They do exist. Lightweight, cost-effective, easy to assemble and dismantle. This has been an argument within the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Yet a curious detail which will relate to our previous episodes of psychological manipulation is that this argument, it's an invisible argument that has literally been fabricated in order to create an easy target to attack. A figment of the imagination that has been conjured. It's time to start swinging outward on these ridiculous talking points and so-called arguments. And so how will we combat this? With receipts, of course. So let's see what the documents say in regards to temporary materials. Let's begin. Now, let's start with the most important aspect here. The term temporary. Let's define it. I've just gone through a few searches here and we'll put them on screen. What we see is that this term is associated with the idea of time. Now, this is an important distinction because the main argument within this idea is that there are temporary materials, right? Quote unquote temporary materials being used, indicating a cheapness, lightweight, and easy to assemble and dismantle. This episode is geared to dismantle this argument. Afterwards, we will go into some depth as to why arguments like this are used and links directly to our psychological manipulation theme. These are links in the chain, and once we begin to learn the tactics of not only those in power, but those who choose to use weak and logically bankrupt arguments, we can see the game clearer. The goal here is to learn myself and to identify how psychological warfare is being used, most likely unknowingly by those making these often slipshod arguments. What I wanted to do was actually investigate the materials surrounding the fair and see what they said about the temporary materials being used. Let's just begin at the start, where most people will actually investigate. We have Wikipedia here, and as the writing of this script here, as I'm researching, we have 4 mentions of temporary. All of them refer to the buildings themselves being temporary. Take note of this. They refer to the buildings being temporary, not materials. Let's look at Grokpedia here. We have more mentions here. Some are indicating the plaster or staff mixture that was intended to be temporary, while others are again mentioning the buildings being temporary. Again, no mention of building materials. The staff mixture was intended for the exterior and obviously has no real structural integrity tied to the structure itself. We are looking for mentions of actual temporary materials used in the engineering and construction of these structures. Let's move on to some publications here. Campbell's Illustrated History of the World's Columbian Exposition, Volume 1. Let's just do a basic search for the term temporary and see if we can find some mentions of these materials. As we can see, there are various mentions of temporary items. We have presidents, loans, some railway track, even a mention of temporary buildings. No materials, though. Let's try Volume 2. We have mentions of staff, some temporary houses, and again a link to temporary construction or temporary buildings, but no materials. No mention in one of the most popular publications of the time, laying out the chronology of this event in 2 massive volumes. Did it mention the use of temporary materials? It's a bit curious. Let's try Martin's World's Fair album here, an atlas and family souvenir. 0. Absolutely no mentions of the word temporary at all. Over 300 pages describing the event. Not one mention. Let's look at the dedicatory and opening ceremonies of the World's Columbian Exposition. Now here we only have a few mentions, 2 indicating a temporary junction, while the 3rd again is mentioning the temporary nature of the buildings. So moving on, we will try the World's Columbian Exposition report of the Committee on Awards at the event, 2 substantial volumes of nearly 1,000 pages each. Volume 1 only has a few mentions, and none of them are in relation to the buildings or materials. The second volume only has 1, completely unrelated also. Next is a publication called Art and Architecture, which was based on the event. This should be a good one. Let's see. And only 2 mentions, and one of them is relating to the temporary nature of the buildings, not the materials. How about this one though? This should be a good one to find the temporary materials. The Historical World's Columbian Exposition and Chicago Guide. We do have a mention of how the construction is of temporary character. And I suppose that's close, yet still relating to the character of the structure, not the materials. The other mentions are of no relevance to either materials or the structures. Let's move on to this one, the best things to see at the World's Fair. And nothing relating to temporary. Let's throw in one of these more image-based ones for fun here. Maybe they will indicate something about temporary materials being used. So how about this one, the Vanishing City? Not one mention here. Maybe the World's Fair album, another image-based one here, just to try again. Absolutely no mentions, again. Okay, we're going to go through this one now, the Columbian World's Fair Atlas. So we have 1 mention, and it is literally the same as one of our previous mentions, actually word for word. Again, the indication of temporary construction of the structures. Not materials, but character of construction. Moving on, we will explore the World's Fair, being a pictorial history of the Columbian Exposition. Again, here we have another historical publication of the event, and we have more instances of the use of temporary, but none of them relate either to the buildings at the exposition or the materials being temporary. Let's look through this one here, titled A World's Fair, and seems to be in tandem with the Cosmopolitan, which was an illustrated monthly magazine. We only have a few mentions here, and none of them are related to the buildings, nor materials. How curious that there seems to be a trend forming here. Alright, next is the publication The Official Directory of the World's Columbian Exposition, another huge volume containing immense amounts of information, roughly 1,250 pages here. We have more mentions, but none are related to the materials or even the buildings themselves, all seeming to point to temporary meetings, members, addresses, and positions. Nothing about the structures, nothing about materials. Okay, here we go. This is a good one. I've used this one many times, simply titled History of the World's Fair. Here we can see some mentions of temporary, yet they are discussing members, positions, a platform, and habitations. The only mentions of temporary buildings was in regards to Washington, D.C. initially. Again, temporary buildings, the structures. No mention of the materials being temporary in this entire volume, which is a history of the event. Maybe this larger volume set will have some indications. The Book of the Fair, which includes several volumes. So let's go through them in order. Volume 1, we have a few mentions here, some unrelated to the fair initially, others relating to business and even a janitor. Yet near the end of the mentions, we again have indication of temporary structures and temporary buildings. Once again, the actual structures themselves, not the materials. Moving on to volume 2 here, we have 1 mention, and it is literally talking about the temporary works within the Midway Plaisance. Volume 3, no mentions. Volume 4, absolutely no mentions. Volume 5, here we have 1 mention, which seems to be the same as the 10th volume, and maybe there is some repeating information here, yet I will include these remaining publications for reference. So we're looking at volume 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And look at this. There's nothing, nothing, nothing. Not one mention in these volumes except until we get to volume 10 again. And we have this repeating section. Just absolutely stunning here. Now what about this one? We're moving on from the Book of the Fair. Let's check the Illinois building and exhibits therein at the World's Columbian Exposition. Again, nothing. No mentions of either buildings or materials. Let's try this one titled The Columbian Exposition and World's Fair Illustrated. So here again we have the same mention as two other publications. Word for word, it seems. Again, not temporary materials, but structures. We then have some obscure mentions of temporary places, rooms, positions, etc. Nothing to indicate the actual materials being used at the event. Maybe just a few more to really hammer this point home here. The Century World's Fair book for boys and girls. We only have a few mentions, temporary shops, addresses, and again a mention of a temporary building. Not materials, just the structures themselves. Let's move on to Columbian Exposition and Chicago's Wonders. Only a couple of mentions in this one, and nothing relating to the buildings or building materials. Here we have the official guide to the World's Columbian Exposition. We only have two mentions, and they do not indicate either the main exposition buildings or the materials. This one is next, the Authentic Guide to Chicago and the World's Columbian Exposition. We have a few mentions here, very similar to previous ones, and even this last one, again, word for word, repeating the section. Yet nothing relating to the temporary nature of the materials. This is a good one though. This is one of my favorites. Shep's World's Fair Photographed. A massive image-based volume with lots of information included. Yet we only have one mention of temporary, and it's in relation to marching past temporary homes of the old world, which were built in the Midway. How about this? Let's get to some heavy hitters here. This one should get us what we're looking for. This is the report of the presidents to the board of directors of the World's Columbian Exposition. Yes, here we go. Alright, 21 mentions. First mention again, temporary buildings, then some power plants, then positions. We have a mention of a temporary wooden structure being erected as a workshop. Again, not the materials, just the structure, a temporary wooden structure. We have a mention of the viaduct being a temporary wooden structure, and even stating this was completed within 23 days. The remaining mentions are all of temporary characters, employment, a kitchen, then we have sidewalks, buildings, hospitals, etc. All indicating structures or services. Not once do we have an indication of temporary materials being used. Lastly, let's look through this one. This book will be used in an upcoming episode, I think. Another substantial volume here, and this is the World's Fair Expenditures, the official report. And alright, as we can see, this is the one, folks. 63 results here. Finally, some juicy details on these mysterious temporary materials. So we will kind of skip over these initial ones, which seem to be in the index, but we have indications of temporary provisions, employment, and then here we go, temporary buildings, propagating houses, construction building, powerhouse. Yet, these are all just line items, it seems. Some temporary organization mentions, temporary accounts, some temporary construction tracks, getting warmer here, employing a temporary force, temporary motions, services, secretary, organization, another force. Not much here really until, wait, this. Look at this. We have an indication on page 176 that they didn't buy the highest price railroad ties, for it is all more or less temporary. Finally, we have some action here. Anything else here, I wonder? Then we have this section for temporary buildings. questions regarding these structures, temporary employment, sidewalks, seats, headquarters, appointees, exhibitions, still nothing though in regards to materials. And that pretty much does it. We have literally zero. Out of all the materials shown in this presentation, this little demonstration here, zero mentions of temporary building materials. Now, in fairness, this was one term, temporary. I suppose one could say, well, why don't you check for synonyms like cheap or flimsy or cost-effective, let's say. I'll leave that option open for people to actually investigate. Yet the main term here is temporary materials. Then what is usually followed is a random slew of materials that have no relation to actual construction, like popsicle sticks. So why go to the trouble of making this point? I'll now explain. I watch other presentations and videos on these expositions and have continually heard this idea, temporary materials. Not only is it used as kind of a cheap and unsubstantiated jab, but it is then stripped down to its lowest form. We hear things like they built this out of balsa wood and popsicle sticks. It's said that they built this from straw and kindling. It finally got to the point where I wanted to find out where these temporary materials are mentioned, ensuring that there was indeed sources or mentions, or anything relating to this idea. What has transpired is discovering that this idea is a literal ghost. There are no mentions of this. None are present in some of the most common publications along with reports, and even the expenditure report for the entire event. What I am attempting to do with this episode here is to initially show that these arguments are as temporary as the buildings. They do not exist in the material, not even on Wikipedia. So where are these ideas coming from? I'll tell you where, and this is my opinion. It goes back again to the psychological manipulation. Let's explore what this is and potentially how it begins and then leaks outward. So at the core of this argument is what is known as a logical fallacy. It's a classic straw man, the misrepresentation or exaggeration of an argument to make it easier to engage, then going on to puff out the chest and dismantle this distorted version as if it were the original. They are fighting ghosts in the machine discussed in the last video. It is an argument that has zero recognition in the various materials we viewed, many of which I've used in these presentations. How I propose this goes on, we will examine a work by a man named Edward Bernays. This work is called Propaganda. Edward Bernays is considered the father of public relations and wrote this work to discuss the idea of propaganda and its evolution into public relations. This is intrinsically tied to psychology, and there is an interesting connection with Bernays and his uncle, who is considered the father of psychology, that being Sigmund Freud. I would like to first somewhat describe or relate how Bernays discusses propaganda. You see, he used to view this term as more neutral, stating that propaganda has certain technical meanings, which, like most things in the world, are neither good nor bad, but custom makes them so. What transpired and what Bernays recognized is that this term has had its definition distorted with the last major war, where propaganda had become sort of distasteful. It was associated with the enemy, and would later be honed and even more effectively used in the Second World War by Joseph Goebbels. He was the chief propagandist for the Nazi Party, and stated that Bernays' work was a direct influence. Anyways, a bit of a tangent there. Back on track. All that is to say that the word propaganda has been rebranded, almost like the swastika has been rebranded, and many get a repulsive recoil-like reaction to either this word or symbol. I must admit, this worked for myself. Hearing the word propaganda indeed had this subconscious negative connotation. I could feel it. Yet, let's see how Bernays defines this term, and move on from there. Hence, any institution or scheme for propagating a doctrine or system, effort directed systematically toward the gaining of public support for an opinion or a course of action. He then briefly discusses how the College of the Propaganda at Rome was founded by the Pope for the goal of educating priests, which is a compelling little detail here. However, what I would like to point out is this section. Judged by this definition, we can see that in its true sense, propaganda is a perfectly legitimate form of human activity. Any society, whether it be social, religious, or political, which is possessed of certain beliefs and sets out to make them known, either by the spoken or written words, is practicing propaganda. Bernays goes on to explain how this word propaganda is essentially a wholesome word that has a history of being honorable, relating how this shift in perspective, this sinister meaning, shows how foolish the adult has become and how the child still remains within them, thinking in these simplistic terms. All this to say is that propaganda is all around us, all the time, and is employed by many who may not even realize it. At its core, Bernays explains that modern propaganda is a constant, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, an idea, or a group. So, we have a consistent and enduring effort to shape events, such as the Columbian Exposition, into a specific idea, a specific viewpoint. We have propaganda. Now, don't be fooled. That's exactly what I'm doing. Is it not? However, the primary difference being that I present evidences to bolster my case and allow you to contend with the data. I've stayed quite consistent in stating that you should not believe what I say. I don't want followers. I would rather curate and create, let's say, challengers. Challenge my ideas. Challenge and question those that you watch and listen to and notice these patterns. Because this leads to my next point, which is when these arguments are used. The temporary materials, for example, we get these almost lethargic sentences like, look at this. Does this look temporary to you? Does this look like balsa wood and toothpicks? It doesn't make any sense. We need to start critically thinking about this. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would they build all of this out of temporary materials? Now, besides the usual deflections of stating things just don't make sense, because that's a stellar argument for any topic, obviously, there was a key detail here. One that I've seen mentioned in comments and even viewers of my content stating that this is a common phenomenon, that being the diminishing of intelligence. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's common. We need to critically think about this. People don't have critical thinking anymore to see this. Essentially, stating that those who do not see the fallacy, they are not thinking themselves. They are not intelligent. This has worked on myself, and that is why I'm trying my best to learn and now relay what I believe is happening with many of these theories and ideas. What is happening here is that there are actually easy ways to bypass someone's subconscious barriers in order to infiltrate and manipulate their psychology. Now, these are not my ideas, not mine at all, yet I find them to be incredibly valuable as a mental defense or even just awareness of how these types of seemingly harmless comments are in actuality tactics. Let me be clear though, crystal clear here. I'm not stating that these researchers or creators are doing this intentionally. I'm sure the large majority of them are genuinely decent people, good people. However, there is also the possibility that some may know these tactics exist or are even employing them because they themselves have been seduced by the very same tactic, then becoming this regurgitating train of manipulation at a subconscious level. There are three main categories that can be challenged within a person. The idea that one is a good person. The moral self-image. People like to think, generally, that they are a good person. They do, or at least try to do the right things. The second one here is that one is smart. The intellectual self-image. No one likes to think that they are an idiot, that they are stupid. People tend to believe that they could never be the one who was fooled. They are informed, of course, and pride themselves on being rational, critical thinkers. The third, lastly, the idea that you are in control, your sense of agency. People obviously reject the idea of being controlled or feeling like puppets. They are the engine that moves their being forward, and there are no external forces that could possibly change this notion without their consent. So we can see how it's the second point here, which is being pressured, when the line of using critical thinking is employed. Now, when you potentially watch other channels who may have used this line, even in tandem with this now debunked temporary materials spiel, what evidence is shown to bolster it? Is it merely the jab at intelligence? It's laughable to think this was made from staff, or wait, laugh and staff? Starting to see a pattern here, folks. We couldn't have possibly built this out of temporary materials. It just doesn't make sense. This is a tactic. It's not logic, it's not an argument. It's misdirection, which is using a technique to mentally hijack viewers into believing the leader through subtle manipulation of intellectual inferiority. Ultimately, where does this line come from? Where does this argument originate from? Honestly, I do not know, and now I'm confident that pressuring anyone using this line would absolutely fail to substantiate it. Therefore, this claim that is made with no evidence, no substance, is baseless. It's a facade. It's unfounded. Why does it spread, though? This concept is discussed with Bernays' propaganda, and surely is recognizable within our society today. Even more so within the last 5 years, let's say, with a few events that have transpired. That being, to convince those leaders that this is a solid argument. For once they begin to regurgitate the information, your job is done. Now, in all honesty, it's a little less effective now. I mean, do you remember when celebrities tried to convince people to take certain medications or even to vote in certain ways? I believe people have woken up to this idea in some respects, yet it is still employed with leaders on this platform. Quote unquote leaders on this platform. Don't get that confused. Once those become invested into this idea, like has been said previously in other episodes, emotionally attached, the hooks are in, the loyalties are cementing, and Edward Bernays discusses this idea almost 100 years ago. Takes account not merely of the individual, nor even of the mass mind alone, but also and especially of the anatomy of society, with its interlocking group formations and loyalties. It sees the individual not only as a cell in the social organism, but as a cell organized into the social unit. Touch a nerve at a sensitive spot, and you get an automatic response from certain specific members of the organism. What seems to be happening here is subtle in psychology, again discussed in propaganda. Let's take a look at this quote here. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing? He goes on to describe how propaganda is indeed a tricky beast and is akin to economics and sociology, where it cannot really be an exact science since it deals with people, and people tend to be both predictable and unpredictable. However, let's read a section in relation to leaders. If you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, You automatically influence the group which they sway. But men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be subject to the influences of mass psychology, because man is by nature gregarious. He feels himself to be member of a herd, even when he is alone in his room with the curtains drawn. His mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on it by the group influences. This then ties in with a section later in the publication discussing how repetition used to work if directed at the consumer. The example of bacon was used. Repetition of how good bacon is, how cheap it is. It gives you reserve energy, and just put it on repeat. What was found even more effective than direct reiteration was to find a new salesman, the leader. In this case, it was the physicians. The newer salesmanship, understanding the group structure of society and the principles of mass psychology, would first ask, who is it that influences the eating habits of the public? The answer, obviously, is the physicians. The new salesman will then suggest to physicians to say publicly that it is wholesome to eat bacon. He knows as a mathematical certainty that large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he understands the psychological relation of dependence of men upon their physicians. In my opinion, this is exactly what is happening online, and especially within these groups, within these ideas, and within these arguments. There are channels with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of viewers and subscribers that state something like the Columbian Exposition was built from temporary materials and the work is done. That's it. This is nothing new. I want you to be able to see these tactics when they are used. They are employed everywhere, even by myself. That's why it's up to you to decide if this information is valuable. I would like to thank those that have mentioned Edward Bernays and his works. They have been a tremendous help. His publication will be linked below should you like to explore it more, and I would say it is recommended reading as a mental defense in this digital world. Even though this digital space did not exist in his time, these principles are still applicable and can be deciphered once they are understood. This leads to the next point, being the idea of temporary buildings and the materials. I've gone through multiple episodes with this series, showing how there have been discrepancies within the information that is usually presented in easily accessible sources, say like Wikipedia, and what sources of the time indicate. There are differences, even exaggerations, stretching of the truth, or in some cases, just blatant lies. These structures were temporary in regards to the definition of the term itself, the time they were to be used. They were not temporary in terms of structural components. We can see that from much of the imagery, from the materials used, from the documentation, from the publications, from the notes we have read through in almost 17 episodes here. We can see it in the companies employed and from the technical reviews that show that these structures were a combination of iron, steel, wood, stone, and brick. The only material often associated with being temporary, if ever, was the exterior mixture of staff, and even in the presentation today, there was limited mention of even that. We can see from the earlier segment that temporary materials does not even occur in the most prolific of sources and documents of the time, ones that would surely include this type of detail. Now, can I state this with absolute certainty? I suppose not. However, I have provided ample evidence to indicate that this idea is lacking. If this was truly a notable argument, it would be mentioned somewhere, anywhere for that matter. It's nowhere to be found. And isn't that just a curious little ghost in the machine? Additionally, Let me add one detail here. This argument does span both ends of the spectrum, let's say. While I have made it more clear that the dismissal of temporary materials is non-existent, that goes for those supporting the idea of the fairs also. To state, of course they built this because they built it from temporary materials, is also questionable. They built all of this with temporary materials. That's what we're told. No, that's what we've been fed. From where? I don't know. But this is the game, though, and it appears many are chewing up the misdirections. So no, they didn't use temporary materials. There is no evidence of that. They used actual materials, built actual buildings, and stated that they were to be temporary, meaning that they would only last for a limited time. And guess what? They didn't finish them. Some materials were stated to be recycled, but the majority of them were set ablaze. And that may require some further investigation. We have here an instance of complete fabrication. So the question I have for you is this: how strong is an idea, is an argument, is a theory, if in order for it to remain, it relies on fictional details? This isn't the first detail I've investigated and found to be wanting, but it is most certainly the first to be completely missing. It is my intention to lay bare some of the tactics and blatant misdirections being played here. As you can see by the channel, I have a passion for collecting and presenting curious and beautiful pieces of our past. Is our past mysterious? Yes. Is it deeper, more intricate, more complicated, full of misdirections itself? Absolutely. It's also worth preserving the stunning creativity and beauty that they contain. In saying that, this episode is a check. As with anything, there is always balance. It is to critique the argument, not the individuals that regurgitate it, over and over and over and over. However, as Bernays wisely stated, repetition is the first law of persuasion.